I want you to kind of look in your packets, and you'll see this form that's kind of printed horizontally here. And at the top of it, it says Outreach Ministry. And basically, it's a simple template for a plan. And I'd like you to go ahead and pull that out of your packets from today. And I believe this may have been sent to you as well with the kind of workshop confirmation. And I'd like you to kind of leave this out because it becomes something I want you to kind of begin to fill in and take notes as thoughts occur to you, because look at everything as you will today through the lens of how am I going to take what I've heard and translate it to me. And if I can't figure that out, now I'm going to put a big star there and I'm going to ask a question, or afterward I'm going to go up and say, Rick, I need 10 minutes. Let's sit down and talk about this. So let's look at this first thing, because right at the top we talk about audience. And we're going to talk about audience for a couple of minutes here. And audience is about you. And I've heard a number of different kinds of things here. Who's most important for you to reach through your ministry? What do you need to do? And I really believe that the question for you to think about is, if you're serving the homeless, is your challenge in the terms of the who, is your audience really that group? Or for this purpose, is your audience your fellow parishioners? Or is your audience people in the community that you're trying to come and join you so your ministry can be more sustainable and more robust and can grow? So I want you to be thinking about that as we talk about audience here, because there are some connections that we're going to make. And then we're going to kind of walk through this in a couple of iterations. What do we want to tell them? What are we trying to accomplish? And then how are we going to do it? So we're going to be sharing examples of ways that you can do things through publicity and through social media and through some, quote, non-traditional ideas between now and 2 o'clock. And then we're going to, this afternoon, have little kind of breakout groups where you're going to share some of these things, and then we'll share them as a group before we break at the end of the day. So let's talk about audience for a couple of minutes, and put your kind of cap on again and begin to think about, you know, within my ministry, who is it that we're really trying to reach here? What is the greatest need that we have? And let's talk about that. And I wanted to share just a little bit of learning from the standpoint of the church itself, and kind of what we've heard about people who are the newcomers, people seeking a new church home, and where they're beginning to find us and find them, and those points of intersection. And there was a kind of a broader kind of quantitative piece of research that was done at the beginning of this process that kind of yielded 3 audiences here, if you will, that represented growth areas. And I suspect in your communities you will find some of these as well. You'll also find things that aren't represented here. For example, earlier we were in Rio Grande, and what they said is, gosh, we've got, this may sound familiar, these people fleeing from the Midwest and the East, and they're moving out here to beautiful New Mexico because they love the weather and the climate and the tax situation out here. And we really have found that this is a perfect occasion, as they begin to seek a new church home, to find ways to connect with them. They may or may not be Anglican or Episcopalian or whatever. They're looking for that place to connect. And so I suspect in your own communities you may have some of that here as well. But the 3 that bubbled up were, first, women between the ages of 25 and 40 with young children. Probably doesn't surprise a lot of you, because at that point, you know, moms may decide, you know, we need to start going to church again. And I'm going to be, typically in the family, the mother is the one who decides where they're going to go, unless there's a very strong previous connection in some area. And this is also true within the Hispanic and Latino community, particularly among women with or without kids. And a lot of it is, and not surprisingly, former Roman Catholics who have fallen away from the church and again are trying to connect, and in many ways they have connected with the Episcopal Church because of our leadership and involvement of women in leadership roles within the church itself. And that connection said we're welcome and accepted within the church. The second is young adults, 19 to 27. And not surprisingly, this generation is one of the most involved generations in social issues and volunteerism really since the 60s, where some of us grew up. So it's kind of like phone back full cycle again. But this kind of group is really interesting for some of our ministries as well to begin to look at that and find those connections, because that service-oriented generation oftentimes as well is not going, and I heard this a bit earlier, is not necessarily showing up on Sundays, is not necessarily connecting with that traditional service, but that doesn't mean that they've lost that seed, and we'll get back to that in a minute. And then the last group is women over the age of 45 with no kids. So may or may not be working full-time, probably are working in some capacity, probably full-time. But family is taking fewer hours of their day. They're very, very involved and service-oriented. They've probably been doing a lot of comparison shopping now that this time is available to them. This is kind of like the tail end of the boomer generation. And also, not surprisingly, is they have begun to cultivate their own communities on places like Facebook and Pinterest and places like that. So if you find, as you begin to think about your own groups, and you're talking about women, and that's an important part of attracting people to your ministry, I would say, well, then guess what? We probably should try to find a way to begin to establish a community, a presence on Facebook, because we can begin to share and attract and engage in those networks through this kind of vehicle.
I'm just curious, those three groups that you just named, they are growing groups that are coming into the Episcopal Church? Is that what you're telling us?
They are growing groups that we have found two things with. One is that we have begun to see those groups, yes, be attracted to church, but those are groups that represent opportunities for us to begin to engage with them because of the connection. So it's a little of both.
What about the other groups?
In other words, anybody else?
Yeah.
It's not meant to be exclusive. It's simply meant to say these areas are areas that seem to have the greatest opportunities in terms of growing numbers.
What about men? I mean,
It's I just said, young adults 19 to 27, for example. So it's not exclusive at all. Men are absolutely important. I'm just saying that these are areas that seem to have more potential than others. It's not meant to be exclusive at all.
after the teen age of 25 with the young adults, which obviously is a mixed group,
Right.
is that then the men drift off to something else because they are working, hopefully?
What we're found in family situations, the woman tends to be the one that selects the church more than the man. It's a matter of degrees. It's not 100% to 0%. That's all. And also in terms of people that have tended to have an affinity to go to church, women more than men have had that affinity to do that, both in the Latino community and otherwise. And again, it's a matter of degrees. It's not an absolute.
I think here in this area we have a great deal of single men and
Right.
women, and a different population than perhaps we grew up with. And that's as part of the wonderful diversity that our church has embraced in the last few years, and I'm very proud of it.
Great.
But we need, I think, to also address the needs of these people, and a lot of them are men.
Perfect. And I think what you've just pointed out is the fact that all these are thoughts to give you a sense where broadly there we have found there seem to be opportunities, but you really need to kind of look within your own community and say, where do we see opportunities Where do we see those connections? Where do we see those audiences? Not just these three, the ones that are right for us. The ones that are right for us. And I really mentioned the kind of young adult group because of the comment earlier that we see a lot of young folks walking away from these kind of traditional services and showing up on Sundays and finding that social service connection. So again, these are examples for you, but you're doing exactly the right thing, which is questioning, gosh, that's good, but what am I seeing in my community? Where do we see the right connections being made? It may be 100% men, for example. Donna, yeah.
Just two thoughts.
Sure.
One is when you mentioned Facebook, I read recently someone that who led services who got up at the beginning of the service and would say, please shut your phones off. And then during the piece would get up and say, please turn your phones on and post where you are on Facebook. Because this way everybody would see that they were in this church, and it was a way to share where they were. Right. But I also think that a group that's missing, and I realize you're focusing on this, is the lesbian and gay community. Mm-hmm. Because that's such a large community that so often is pining to be received and embraced in the church. They often have young children, mm-hmm. Married now, as I am. So I think that's an important group demographic that we're all missing out on if we don't welcome.
And in fact, I think you may have seen, if you go to the church website, the presiding bishop just issued a statement yesterday reaffirming the welcoming nature and embracing the LGBT community here. So, you know, again, that's a very, very good example. This is not meant to be exclusive. It's simply meant to say, we see opportunities church-wide here. What's right in your community? Father.
So who is the decision about these three major groups? Who's putting that forward?
It's simply what came out of the research that found here's where people are in the community.
One of my questions is, what about the Latino community? And very present, we have very few, if any, present here. But I think locally and then also within our Episcopal Church, we've seen that as a major area to reach out to. And especially in social media, there's wonderful ways of doing that.
Father Anthony Guillen is leading a whole social media effort in that area, including online radio ministry and many things. And certainly in this community, probably the most prominent Hispanic minister in certainly this part of the hemisphere is based here in terms of his media ministries as well. So yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I think the example among women, Latinas in particular, in terms of making those decisions, connecting with women in leadership, hugely important to the church in the United States, much less certainly in Hispanic countries. Father.
What is the source of the research?
A couple of things. One is the first part in terms of the broad research. It's literally a cross-section analysis of demographics across the country.
Across the country.
Okay. Yes, sir. And the second that I'm going to talk about in a minute is really in-depth interviews with people just to kind of establish what are their emotional connections. But it's broad. And certainly these things would vary if you look at specific areas of the country, and certainly South Florida is one of the, I would say, most, and one of the qualitative groups was actually done here in South Florida, I believe.
And is that the wide research outcome, is that available?
Yeah, there's more information about that available that I certainly can provide to you. Yes.
Would you please?
Absolutely.
I tell you why I'm asking.
Sure.
I think South Florida, and I'm hearing the conversation here, South Florida is unique. Mm-hmm. At Holy Family, we have 24 nationalities and several cultures present, and they're growing. For example, the Nigerian community present at Holy Family is a growing experience here in South Florida.
Right.
In Miami Gardens, the Haitian community is growing. So that's where I'm coming from. The word is diversity, which has been reflected here. So that's why I ask about the research, to be able to look on my own more closely.
Right, and you may not be able to drill down, but I think the point that you're making is, and I think the commonality too, when you look at these, it goes beyond kind of looking at the community and saying, what's the dynamic that's occurring here that are causing people to change? So a case when children may be leaving the home. There's a case where women with young children may be looking to create a home. And that could be Haitian, that could be Cuban, that could be Caucasian. We have this group of young adults who, again, cross demographic, are finding more of a service orientation. So again, those are ideas for you to spark. What relationship would that have here? And again, so it tends to be not exclusive, but inclusive there.
To the same point, I was just wondering if you'll be giving us any idea how we can study our local demographics. You have a national profile,
Sure.
and we can see what the national norm is, but you know, what will you give us some ideas how we can?
Sure, and we'll just talk about that for a second in terms of audience. And one thing that I found to be very successful, but not easy necessarily for everyone to do, is simply to ask. And to ask in a couple of ways. One is simply to ask through individuals when they perhaps come and register, to ask through surveys in the pews, to ask in those kinds of contexts. The other thing you can do is there's a lot of information available to you, just pure demographically at a county level as well. So perhaps we can talk a little bit more offline there, but I think there's certainly public data available locally that's census-based, that is free and available online that you can find. But I am a huge believer in asking the question of the people you're serving first in their community, in their perspective, because you often are surprised by what you begin to hear back, not just in terms of kind of who they are in their orientations, but how they get information, how they share information, and what's important to them. Okay. So a couple of other things we're asking. Again, I think this is important to say, these kind of emotional connections that came after kind of really deep, like 2-hour conversations with individuals where there were 3 questions asked. What are their earliest experiences? How did they begin to kind of connect with and discover the church and find a home? And there are just 3 points that I wanted to make. You know, particularly for people who had grown up in a structured church environment, they kind of connected it with this sense of judgment, if you will. And maybe that's from Bible lessons early from the Old Testament, I'm not sure, but this notion and connection as well. But there was both this kind of understanding of this kind of formulaic spirituality, the ritual that may not have been as approachable then. Now they're starting to find comes back. They miss a little bit of that discipline and structure, if you will. But this last point I think is particularly relevant for us here. This idea of searching for and kind of reconnecting and finding this affirming community, you know, people of like interest, people that are welcoming you, people that truly do welcome you and make you feel at home. I attended a service last Sunday at St. Timothy's in Cincinnati, and I'll talk about St. Timothy a little bit later, but I was raised Catholic, and you know, you're kind of forced there to go say hi to the people around you because people kind of stand. It's always been my experience. Now it's time to go ahead and say hello. When I walked into St. Timothy's and stood in the pew, literally everyone around me before the service turned around and said, "I don't think I've seen you here before. I'm John. Who are you?" And I don't know if our rector, Green, kind of has instilled that into the group, but it blew me away because it was everything that we had talked about. And we had seen that in other cases before, which is, I don't feel welcome there. What can I do? And boy, that said everything. They would not let me out unless people introduced themselves and said hello and invited me back. just day to day. So this notion of affirming community, and you can see this in your food pantries and the volunteers and the shelter work that you're doing. Gosh, there's shared emotion and passion and focus, and those kinds of connections become very, very important to this group. So I'd just like you to take a minute, and this is rich conversation because we've heard about audiences that are important to you in South Florida, and to you in your own communities, and to the people around you that you can connect with and seek and find. But we've also touched on these ideas of people going through life changes and passages and different connections, no matter what their experience is, or their demographic, or their national origin. Take a minute and just write on your template, if you are looking at what you think are one or two really important audiences for you to reach, either people that you want to bring into your ministries or people your ministry is trying to touch. Write them down for a minute. We'll come back this afternoon and talk about them just a little bit. Give you just a minute, and then we're going to write down two more things. And you may have more than one audience, but let's try to keep it for our purposes today to one or two that just jump out at you as important to you. Now let's take a minute and do the next thing. And this is kind of hard as well. I want to talk about your goal. What's the most important thing you want communications to accomplish for you with this audience? Do you want them to be able to learn about you? Do you want them to be able to connect to you? Do you want them to do something? What do you want? What's your goal with this audience? What are you trying to accomplish? And you'll see in your form on the boxes on the left what we want to achieve, what we want to accomplish. Go ahead and write one or two things in there. Sure. So yeah, when you see these right here in your form, you can just put a note there. What's a goal or two here? And this is an iterative process, particularly in this case, because it does require reflection. But the biggest thing I've found, get your gut ideas down, get your initial thoughts down, because they really allow you to build on something. Don't try to overthink it. What do we want to do? What do we want to accomplish? So we'll spend another minute on that. Then we'll take a last exercise for a couple minutes, and we'll talk about what's one or two things we want to say to them. If this were study hall, you'd all be getting an A. All right, so we've thought about an audience or two we want to reach. We've thought about one or two things we'd like to accomplish. Now I'd like you to take a couple of minutes and think about what's one or two things we want to say to them that they will find relevant. What do we want to tell them? Think about it, not what we want them to hear. Then try to put yourself in their shoes for a moment. What do they care about? Put yourself in their shoes. If it's someone who you're asking to volunteer, what do they care about? Why should they follow you? If it's someone you're seeking to serve in your ministry or attract to your congregation, what are they thinking about? And you may find you don't know, which that's an action item for you. I need to go find out when I go back home. I need to learn more about what they care about, because until I know that, I can't do an effective message to them. But that's good. We have a start. You're not going to be perfect. These are going to be very rough, and you may have, I'm not sure yet, but let's get a baseline set and we'll come back to that. Okay? And you'll see some teasers here. How can you communicate this idea of acceptance of them? That there's a connection, you know where they're coming from. The ways that you are serving in a way that might connect with, again, this group that is very interested in helping one another or within the community. Are there shared experiences or things that you might be able to offer, or a story or an example?